It was nearly 3 a.m. at Boston Maternity Hospital when I walked into the quiet recovery ward and saw her. Tiny, still pink, swaddled in a patterned hospital blanket, eyes barely open under the softest lashes I'd ever seen. She didn't cry, just made these tiny snuffling sounds, like she was trying to understand what the world had just done to her. And maybe she was, because her mother had left. Just like that, signed the release and disappeared. I'd seen it happen before. Over 20 years as a labor and delivery nurse, you learn not to flinch. You learn to put the paperwork ahead of the heartbreak. But this time, something cracked. This baby didn't feel like the others. There was something about her, the way her fingers curled instinctively toward warmth, the way she hiccuped softly in her sleep, the sheer helplessness of her being left behind. I sat beside her bassinet longer than I should have, just watching her breathe. My mind kept drifting back to a memory I thought I'd buried. Our child, the one I never got to meet, the one I lost halfway through a difficult pregnancy years ago. The pain had dimmed over time but never disappeared. It lived quietly inside me, surfacing now in the presence of this little girl who had no name and no one. I reached out, rested a finger lightly against her tiny palm. She grasped it. I froze. And just like that, I knew. I couldn't leave her here. I couldn't let her become just another folder in the system. I didn't care what Richard would say. I had to try. I stepped out into the empty hallway and took a deep breath. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and dialed him. He answered on the third ring, his voice clipped and tired. "Eliza? It's the middle of the night. Is something wrong?" "Richard," I began, already stumbling over my words. "I need to ask you something. It's important. There's a baby, a newborn. Her mother left. Just walked out. She's perfectly healthy. She's beautiful. No, the word cut through like a blade. Don't even start." I pressed on. "Please just hear me out. I've never asked for anything, Richard. Not really. But I can't leave her here. I want to bring her home. Just for a while. Please." "You've lost your mind," he snapped. "We're not adopting someone else's mistake. You don't know where that child came from. Her mother could be a junkie or worse. We're not getting involved in something that could ruin our lives." My voice broke. "You know how much I've wanted a child. After everything we've lost. That was years ago, Eliza. Let it go. We have a life, a reputation. I won't have you dragging some stranger's baby into our home." I don't remember what I said next. I only remember shouting. He shouted back, and then the line went dead. I stood there in the dim hallway, heart pounding, fingers numb. I must have wandered, because the next thing I knew, I was in the nurse's washroom, gripping the edge of the sink, trying not to fall apart. My reflection in the mirror looked like someone else. Someone older, lonelier, and unbearably tired. I let the tears come. I wasn't crying just for her, the baby alone in that crib. I was crying for me, too. For everything I'd held in for so long. For the years spent trying to be the perfect wife. For the child I'd lost and the motherhood that never came. And yet, in that grief, something else flickered. I didn't care what Richard said. That baby needed someone. And for the first time in a long, long time, I needed someone too. Maybe we could save each other. I don't remember much about the ride home that night. Just the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers, the blurred city lights, and the growing ache in my chest. Boston had never felt colder. The streets were slick with rain, but the chill I felt came from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. Memories I thought I'd outgrown started clawing their way back. Maine, the tiny town where I was born, the rundown trailer we called home. My father's slurred yelling behind closed doors, the sour stench of beer spilled on the kitchen table. My mother, distant and silent, chain-smoking by the window as if hoping to disappear into the smoke. They never really fought because they didn't really talk. Not to each other, not to me. Love in that house was something unspoken or maybe just unlived. At school, I was the girl with thrift store shoes and patched-up jeans. The one who never brought lunch and never got invited anywhere. I learned to shrink into corners, to keep my head down, to stay quiet. But deep inside, I made myself a promise. I would get out. I would never live like that again. And I didn't. I studied hard, pushed through community college, and scraped my way into nursing school in Boston. That city was supposed to be my escape, and in many ways it was. That's where I met Richard Whitmore. He wasn't charming, not in the way most people mean it. He was older, composed, successful. He owned a high-end building supply company and carried himself like a man used to winning. When we met, I was renting a tiny studio apartment and barely making rent. He walked into the store I worked at, asked a few questions about cabinet hinges, and then about me. He didn't sweep me off my feet. There were no flowers, no grand declarations. Just calm, steady interest. He liked that I was quiet, that I didn't drink, didn't party, didn't ask for much. He once told me I was a safe investment, and I pretended it was a compliment. We got married the following spring. For a while, I believed it was enough. He had a good reputation, a beautiful home on Beacon Hill, and he never raised his voice in public. I told myself that stability was better than passion, that being cared for was close enough to being loved. But over the years, the cracks deepened. Richard didn't like being questioned. He had opinions about everything: how I should wear my hair, what I should cook, which friends I could see. The thermostat stayed at exactly 70, the towels had to be folded a certain way, and the floors were never clean enough. He demanded perfection, and I gave it to him because I didn't know what else to do. To outsiders, we looked like a model couple, but inside that elegant brownstone, I was just another part of the decor, tidy, silent, replaceable. I had traded the chaos of my childhood for a different kind of emptiness. And that night, as I turned the key in our front door and stepped into our pristine kitchen, I realized something terrifying. I might be trapped again. Only this time the cage was velvet-lined, and I'd walked into it willingly. There was a time I thought a baby might save us. It had been 5 years since our wedding when I found out I was pregnant. I still remember standing in the cramped staff bathroom at the hospital, holding the test in my shaking hands, staring at the 2 pink lines as if they couldn't possibly be real. My knees gave out. I sank to the floor, sobbing, not just from joy, but from sheer disbelief. I told Richard that night over dinner. He didn't leap from his chair or sweep me into his arms, but his eyes softened. He nodded, muttered something about carrying on the Whitmore name, and poured us both a glass of sparkling water instead of wine. That was his version of celebration. I thought maybe this would change things between us. Maybe the idea of becoming a father would thaw something in him. It didn't. He didn't slow down, didn't ask how I was feeling. He still expected the same spotless floors, the same multi-course meals, the same perfectly pressed shirts laid out each morning. When I mentioned the nausea or the cramping, he'd wave it off. It's pregnancy, Eliza, not the plague. Women have been doing this for centuries. You'll be fine. Then came that night, the one I try not to remember, but never really forget. I had just finished a long shift, my back was aching and my feet were swollen. I'd barely stepped through the door when Richard asked where dinner was. He'd invited 2 clients over for lunch the next day and wanted the guest room cleaned, the guest towels replaced, and the dining room set appropriately. He didn't care that I looked pale or that I couldn't keep down more than crackers. I was in the middle of mopping the hallway because he said it smelled musty when the pain started. Sharp, deep wrong. And then blood. So much blood. I screamed. Richard came running, and I saw it in his face. Panic, guilt, maybe even fear. He called the ambulance, held my hand, sat beside me in the ER, silent and pale. But it was too late. Our child, our only child, was gone. He was apologetic after that, tried to do better, bought flowers, took me to dinner, stayed home more. But by then it didn't matter. Something inside me had collapsed. I stopped crying. I stopped hoping. I stopped feeling much of anything. And somewhere deep inside, I decided I would never let myself dream of being a mother again. The next morning, I woke to a smell I hadn't encountered in our home in, 15 years? Maybe more. Eggs. I pulled on my robe and padded down the hall, half convinced I was still dreaming. There, in our kitchen, the same spotless, stainless steel space where I had cooked 1,000 meals without thanks, stood Richard, in pajama pants, at the stove. He turned when he heard me and gave a faint smile, like he wasn't quite sure what he was doing. "I made breakfast," he said, as if it were something he did every Saturday. The eggs were overdone, the toast slightly burnt. He'd drawn a crooked, smiley face in ketchup on the plate. I stared at it in disbelief. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked, not even trying to hide my suspicion. "I thought about what you said," he replied, his tone quieter than usual. "About the baby. I may have overreacted last night." That was the understatement of the year. He sat down across from me, folding his hands. "If this really means that much to you, if you still want to bring her home, we can do it." I didn't speak right away. Part of me wanted to jump into his arms. Another part hesitated. He'd never offered me anything like this before. Never bent, never softened. Was this real or guilt? But it didn't matter. My heart surged with hope. I whispered, "Thank you, really, thank you." He gave a short nod. "So, what do we name her?" I smiled, already having decided. "Lucy. It feels warm. Gentle." Richard stiffened slightly. "No, I was thinking. Lydia." I blinked. "Lydia. It's a strong name," he said, "and it reminds me of someone." I wanted to ask who. I wanted to press, but something in his eyes told me not yet. So I let it go. "All right," I said softly. "Lydia it is." That evening we brought Lydia home. She was so small in my arms, barely more than a whisper. The house, our cold, perfectly curated brownstone, suddenly felt too sharp, too bright, too large. I led Richard upstairs to the nursery we'd never used, the room that had stayed sealed for over a decade. He didn't say a word, just opened the door and let me carry her in. Later, I filled the baby tub with warm water while Richard hovered nearby, unsure of what to do. I laid Lydia gently into the bath, her little legs kicking softly as the water embraced her. "She's so peaceful," I murmured. Richard stepped closer, towel in hand. "She smells like soap and something else, something new." We laughed, awkward, tentative. Then, as I lifted her out and began drying her off, I noticed his expression shift. His brow furrowed, his eyes narrowed. "What is that?" he asked sharply. "What's what?" I followed his gaze. Hanging loosely around Lydia's tiny neck was a delicate gold cross. I hadn't noticed it before. It must have slipped under her collar when the nurses dressed her. It was small, elegant, the kind of piece someone would have made with care. Richard reached out and gently touched it, then froze. His face went pale. He didn't speak at first, just stared like he was seeing a ghost. "Eliza," he finally whispered. "This cross. I know this cross. What are you talking about?" He sat down on the edge of the bed, gripping the towel with white knuckles. "Over 20 years ago, when I was barely out of college, I had a relationship. It wasn't serious. She got pregnant. I told her I wasn't ready. I didn't want the baby. And when she died giving birth, I let them take the child. I walked away." He looked up at me, his voice breaking. "But before I did, I had this cross made. Custom. Gold, with that same engraving on the back. I gave it to the nurses and asked them to put it around the baby's neck." I couldn't breathe. "You're saying Lydia is your granddaughter?" "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "But that's the same cross. I swear to you, Eliza, that's the one." I stepped back, heart pounding. "You had a daughter? And you never told me." He looked down, ashamed. I thought it was behind me. I thought I could just move on. I stared at him, then at Lydia. "No," I said, my voice low and shaking. "We're getting a DNA test. Tomorrow." The envelope came 3 days later. It was thick, official-looking, and completely silent as I held it in my hands, but it screamed in my chest. I waited until Richard got home. He was pacing before I even opened it. Lydia lay asleep in the next room, her soft breath steady, unaware that we were about to measure her place in our world with a percentage. I slid a finger under the seal. Inside, clinical words, printed lines, barcodes, all wrapped around one brutal number. 0. 0% biological relation between Richard Whitmore and Lydia Rose. Richard read it 3 times. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the paper like it might change if he stared long enough. "That's impossible," he finally muttered. "That can't be right." "The cross. It's right," I said. "It's definitive." He stood, ran a hand through his hair. "But that cross, Eliza, that exact cross. I had it made. There's no way it could have ended up on another child." I wanted to feel relief, but all I felt was confusion. Maybe it was passed along, given away, or maybe someone else wore it. Richard shook his head. "That's not the kind of thing you give away." He looked shaken, and to his credit, he didn't talk about giving Lydia back. He didn't retreat. He just sat down beside her crib that night, staring at her for hours, like the answers might be written in her tiny face. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about the woman who left her behind. There had to be a record, a signature, a file in the hospital database. So I pulled some strings at the nurse's desk. The intake forms listed a name. Hannah Fields, 21 years old, no listed emergency contact, no follow-up address. But there was a street, something scrawled in pen at the bottom of the chart. An old mailing address on the outskirts of Cape Cod. That was all I needed. Richard was still frozen in thought, his mind stuck in the past. But mine was already moving forward. If we couldn't explain the cross, maybe she could. And I intended to find her. Cape Cod in winter isn't the postcard version most people imagine. It's empty, skeletal. The beaches are cold and colorless. The wind smells of salt and sadness. And the little towns feel like they folded in on themselves. It was in one of those towns, barely more than a scattering of houses along a forgotten road, that we found her. Hannah Fields. Her name had haunted my thoughts since I first saw it on Lydia's intake form. No phone number, no email, no family. Just a smudged address and a whisper of someone who had vanished the moment she gave birth. The house looked abandoned. Peeling white paint, shutters hanging loose. A porch that sagged under our steps. We knocked. Nothing. I was about to leave when I noticed a flicker behind the curtain. Movement, hesitation. Then the door creaked open. She stood in the doorway like a shadow. Thin. Pale. Barely a woman. Her cheeks hollow, her posture guarded. Dyed pink hair faded at the roots. A threadbare hoodie over a tank top, despite the freezing wind. She looked at me like I was danger and maybe I was. "I don't know you," she said, her voice scratchy. I took a slow breath. "My name is Eliza. This is my husband, Richard. We've been caring for your daughter." Her eyes narrowed. I didn't give anyone permission. "I know," I said gently. "We're not here to fight. We have questions. About the necklace. About the cross." At that, something flickered in her face. She stepped aside. "Come in, but don't touch anything." Inside, the house was even colder than outside. Dust clung to every surface, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. We sat on a couch with springs poking through, while Hannah perched on the edge of a milk crate. "The cross," she said quietly. "It's not mine. It belonged to someone else, someone I knew. Her name's Margaret, but we called her Maggie." She stared at her hands. "We grew up together in foster care. Same group home. Same cheap bunk beds. She was the good one, always trying to believe life could be different." I glanced at Richard. His eyes had gone distant. Hannah went on. "When I found out I was pregnant, I wanted to disappear. Maggie gave me that cross the day I left. Said it didn't bring her much luck, but maybe it would bring the baby some." She looked at me then, suddenly raw. I didn't want to be a mother. I didn't think I could be. Her voice cracked. "I just wanted to run." I didn't say anything. Not yet. But in that moment, I knew two things for certain. This girl wasn't cruel. She was just broken. And somehow, this all led back to Maggie Morgan. The moment we stepped out of Hannah's crumbling house and back into the wind, I knew something had shifted. My mind couldn't stop replaying her words, the name, Maggie Morgan. The surname struck me first. Morgan. It wasn't rare, but it wasn't nothing either. And the way Richard went silent when Hannah said it, how he stared past her like someone who'd seen a ghost, that haunted me more than anything else. Back in the car, he didn't speak. Not until we were halfway down the coast, headlights cutting through fog and silence. Her name wasn't Margaret when she was born, he finally said. We named her Grace. I turned to look at him, pulse thudding in my throat. She was your daughter, I said softly. Wasn't she? He nodded once. I was barely 20, too ambitious for a child, too selfish to admit it. Her mother wanted to keep her. I said no. I signed the papers and walked away. His voice was flat, but his hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. And you never tried to find her? I asked. What would I have said, he snapped. That I threw her away for a corner office and stock options? I didn't answer. The rest of the drive home blurred into gray. I couldn't stop thinking about that little silver cross, how it had made its way from a baby abandoned by her father to another baby abandoned by her mother. There was something cruel in the symmetry of it. Something holy, too, as if the universe had kept passing the same thread between women, trying to stitch a wound that refused to close. That night, I dug into every public record I could access. I looked up Margaret Morgan, cross-referenced adoption databases, searched forums for adult adoptees. It felt strange, scouring the internet in the dark, searching for someone else's daughter, someone I had no claim to. And yet, in a way I couldn't explain, it didn't feel like she was only Richard's daughter anymore. She was the girl who had given up the one thing she had left, her necklace, to give hope to another lost child. The gesture had rippled across time and bloodlines and reached my hands. When I finally found a record, an old group home report listing Margaret Morgan and Hannah Fields as residents, I stared at the names for a long time. The date matched. The location was right. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a door, and I was going to walk through it. I closed my laptop and looked across the room at Richard, who was staring into a glass of whiskey like it held all the answers. I'm going to find her, I said. He didn't argue. He just whispered, barely loud enough to hear, I don't deserve it. Maybe he didn't, but Maggie did. We found her. After days of tracing old addresses and contacting someone from the group home staff who remembered her, we ended up at a brick building near the design school in Boston, a converted brownstone dormitory. She lived on the third floor in room 3C. I don't know what I expected when she opened the door. Maybe someone angry, maybe someone cold. But not this. The girl who looked back at us had Richard's eyes. They were green, sharp, and rimmed with disbelief. She wore a charcoal hoodie stained with ink and charcoal smudges, and her arms were crossed so tight it looked like she was holding herself together. Hi, I said gently. Are you Maggie? She didn't answer me. Her gaze snapped to Richard. You. Her voice was low, and then louder, with a tremble that made me step back. What are you doing here? I'm Richard tried. I just wanted to. No, the word hit the hallway like a slap. She moved to shut the door. Please, he said, stepping forward. I didn't know about Hannah, about the baby. I didn't come to make excuses. I just needed to see you. To say, I'm sorry. Maggie laughed. A short, sharp sound that wasn't joy at all. Sorry? You're sorry now. After 21 years. She pointed at him, her fingers shaking. You told my mother you weren't ready, that you had a future to protect. So I grew up without one. Richard stood frozen. His lips parted, but nothing came out. You think showing up with some clean suit and sad puppy eyes makes it better, she said, stepping back into her room. And then the door slammed shut. The sound echoed in the hallway. We stood there in silence. I could hear her sobbing through the door, muffled by layers of drywall and pain, and all I could do was reach for Richard's hand. But he pulled away. Back outside, under the gray Boston sky, he sat on the bench beside our car and stared at nothing. I had never seen him like that, so hollow, so small. The man who once measured life by contracts and control was now drowning in a truth he couldn't amend. "I deserve that," he said finally. I didn't reply, not because I agreed or disagreed, but because there was nothing else to say. Some doors, once slammed, don't open again. And yet, in the quiet that followed, I couldn't stop thinking, maybe they don't need to. Maybe they just need to stay closed so something new can open. The cottage felt different. There was warmth now, not just from the crackling fireplace or the afternoon sun slipping through the curtains, but from something quieter, something softer. Hannah sat cross-legged on the rug, holding Lydia in her arms. She wasn't perfect at it. Her hands trembled when the baby cried, and she fumbled through diaper changes like a first-time mom. But she was trying, and more than that, she was present. I watched from the kitchen doorway as she whispered lullabies to Lydia, her voice raspy but tender. Her pink-dyed hair fell into her eyes, and Lydia reached up, grabbing a strand with tiny, curious fingers. Hannah laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from her before. It was uneven, but it was real. It had taken weeks to get here. At first, Hannah wouldn't even hold her. She'd sit on the edge of the bed, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, afraid to look at the child she'd once given up. But day by day, we built something. Routines, small wins, trust. I taught her how to swaddle, how to recognize the different cries, how to breathe when anxiety hit like a wave. And somewhere along the way, I stepped back. That was the hardest part. I loved Lydia like she was mine. From the moment I first held her at the hospital, I'd imagined raising her, watching her first steps, hearing her first words. But this wasn't about me. It was about what was right. So I let go. Not all at once, but enough. I still helped when Hannah needed sleep, still sang lullabies when she ran out of words. But I no longer hovered, no longer corrected every little thing. Richard stood in the doorway one evening, watching them curled together on the couch. Hannah had fallen asleep, Lydia tucked into the crook of her arm. He didn't say a word, just looked at them with something I hadn't seen before, a quiet ache and a sliver of hope. "She's a good mother," I whispered. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Maybe one day Maggie will see that. Maybe she'll let me try again." I didn't answer. Some wounds need time. But in that small house, with laughter beginning to echo and lullabies finding their way back into the walls, I felt something else too. A beginning. We met at the public garden near Beacon Hill, just as the last blush of spring was settling into the city. Hannah held Lydia close, her arms wrapped around the tiny girl as if grounding herself for what was to come. Richard stood beside me, his hands trembling slightly, and for once, not from anger or pride. He looked like a man stripped of all armor. Then Maggie arrived. She was poised, confident, wearing a navy pea coat over her art student attire. Her eyes locked on Richard's, and for a heartbeat, I thought she might turn around and walk away. But she didn't. She stopped, standing a few feet away from her biological father, arms crossed over her chest, eyes sharp like broken glass. Richard tried to speak, but no words came out. Maggie beat him to it. "Why now?" she asked, voice clipped. "Is this some kind of redemption tour? Want me to pose for a family photo with the child you didn't raise and the woman you ignored for 20 years? Richard flinched. "I didn't know how to be a father," he finally said, voice cracking. "I was a coward. I cared more about my reputation, my practice, my money than the people I should have protected." Maggie's gaze shifted slightly. "You knew about me." "I did," he whispered, ashamed. "And I tried to forget. But that cross around Lydia's neck, it brought everything back. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I want to look you in the eye and say I'm sorry." There was a long silence. Then Maggie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small object. It was the same cross, tarnished, a little bent, but unmistakably the one Richard had described. "I wore it," she said, her voice softer, "when I was little. Then I threw it away because I hated you." She looked over at Lydia in Hannah's arms, then back at her father. But Hannah told me something that stuck. Forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of resentment. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "I'm not here to play happy family, Richard, but I'm done carrying this hate." Then she placed the cross in Richard's palm, turned and walked away, leaving behind something heavier than gold, but lighter than pain. A year later, I stood in our kitchen, barefoot, with a hand resting on my belly, still half in disbelief. I was pregnant. At 39, after years of doctors, miscarriages, and closed doors, the impossible had happened. My body, which had once only known grief, now held life again. Richard found me there that morning, the sunlight casting long lines across the hardwood floor. He placed his hand over mine, and for the first time in a long time there were tears in his eyes, but not the kind born from shame or regret. These were new, lighter, freer. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "No," I said quietly, "but we all get second chances, Richard, even the ones who never ask for them." We weren't perfect, not even close, but somehow the pieces had started falling into place, not by force, not by duty, but by something softer, something that had only arrived when we stopped trying to control everything. Maggie was the first to visit when she heard the news. She came with her fiancé, a kind-eyed architecture student who adored her. They were planning a fall wedding, one with wildflowers, a live band, and no trace of the ghosts that once haunted her childhood. And when she asked Richard to walk her down the aisle, it was not out of tradition, but choice. That day, as I watched him straighten his tie and brush invisible dust from his lapel, I saw a man reborn, still flawed, still stubborn, but proud in a way that made something in my heart finally loosen. Hannah had never left. She stayed on in the guest room, at first to help with Lydia, but eventually just because she belonged. She and I became a team, sometimes co-parents, sometimes quiet companions during late-night tea, sometimes just two women learning how to heal side by side. Lydia called us both Mama without hesitation, and somehow that felt right. Lydia. Oh, Lydia. She had started school that year, tiny backpack, crooked smile, and the kind of laughter that made strangers turn their heads. She was the heart of this family, though she didn't know it. A child once discarded, now the glue binding 3 generations of broken women. She brought light into rooms that had known only silence, joy into rituals that once felt hollow. Every time she reached for Maggie's hand or kissed Hannah's cheek, it was as if the universe was repairing itself through her tiny fingertips. Sometimes I would find her sitting in the window seat, humming to herself while holding the very same cross that once unraveled our world. She didn't know its full history yet, but one day she would. And I hoped when that time came, she would feel proud. Not because we were perfect, but because we chose each other again and again. We are not the family I imagined in my youth. We are something stranger, deeper, stitched together by pain and grace and 1,000 small decisions to stay, to try to love, even when it's hard. And as I tucked Lydia into bed one night, our unborn child shifting gently beneath my hand, I kissed her forehead and whispered, "Baby girl, we thought we were saving you." She blinked up at me, puzzled. "But really," I smiled, "you're the one who saved us."